morning, everyone. Our Bible reading today comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 25 to 40. And you'll find this in your service booklets as well as on the screens. Now, about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not. Those who mourn, as if they did not. Those who are happy, as if they were not. Those who buy something, as if it were not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away. I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone is worried that he might not be acting honourably towards the virgin he is engaged to, and if his passions are too strong and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He is not sinning. They should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion, but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then, he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does better. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord. In my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. This is the word of the Lord.
Probably a good idea to keep the passage open, because I'll refer to it on and off. As James said, this is the third sermon in our Loving One Another series. So we had church family, then we had friendship, and then next week we'll have marriage. Singleness is kind of the hospital pass of the sermons, because obviously it's a more difficult topic for many reasons. I imagine the sermon on singleness will hold different levels of interest, unlike the first 2 weeks, because we're all part of the family of God and we're all engaged in friendships. So it might depend on your life circumstances, obviously your marital status, as to whether this is a topic top of mind much of the time, or whether it's a topic that's a distant thought. And there's a wide range of responses to the prospect of listening to me for 30 minutes, on singleness. There's a risk it'll be a major disappointment to some, not answering your most pressing questions, because it's a big topic, and boring to others, thinking that being single gives you, not being single gives you a kind of free pass to daydream. So without setting expectations too high, I think the passage we're looking at is really helpful, and it says some remarkably profound things given it was written 2,000 years ago. It's actually quite positive about singleness, and as it turns out, it's got my favourite 3 verses in 1 Corinthians, just to keep you on the edge of your seat. So whether you're single or not, stay tuned, not least because in order to love one another, the title of the 4-week series, we need to put the interests of others ahead of ourselves. So whether married or single, we should be interested in how best to live as a single person. Should you stay single or should you get married? This is actually the subject of the passage, as we saw. The first 3 words in verse 25 start by saying, "Now about virgins." It's kind of a say what moment in the Bible. What's this about virgins? It's literally translated, so it is the word for virgin as we would understand it in our day. But I think virgins here is best understood as engaged young women, and it's translated differently in different Bible versions. So some versions translate virgins as the betrothed, an old-fashioned term for the engaged, and the RSV, for example, translates it as the unmarried. And I think the context here is pretty clear. Some men in the church in Corinth had apparently asked Paul, because at the beginning of this chapter, Paul talks about the letter you wrote to me. So a letter arrives to Paul from Corinth, and they say, what are we going to do about getting married? Should I get married or not? Others may well have been thinking, should I look for a partner or not? And wondering how hard to try. So elsewhere in this chapter in 1 Corinthians, Paul deals with other marital statuses. He talks to people married to Christians, people married to non-Christians. He also talks to people who are widowed. And in our passage, he's primarily talking to single people. So should you be looking to get married or stay single? How much should you invest in the question of whether you are coupled up or not? And can you be fulfilled and single? Can anyone, as the title of my sermon said, be happily unmarried? So these are the kind of questions that Paul deals with in the passage we're looking at, and I'm going to follow him through the passage, through that minefield of questions, hoping not to be collateral damage or get any shrapnel wounds. See how we go. Should you get married or stay single? Certainly for most people in our day, the answer is pretty straightforward. I think of Jane Austen's opening lines in Pride and Prejudice. It's a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. I think the sentiment reflects early 19th century polite society, but notwithstanding a couple of hundred years and several decades of feminism, it's still true that men and women in general would prefer to be married. Western societies generally hold that in a relationship is superior as a state to being celibate. If you listen to AM radio, which I do when Toby's in the car, they'll sometimes interview some celebrity or some pop star, and they'll ask, are you single? And what they mean is, are you available? Are you in between relationships, or are you already coupled up? So to be single and not having sex, to be blunt, for any length of time is clearly not what anyone would want, at least in modern Western culture. That's the setting in which we find ourselves. And it may well be harder today to be single than ever before, because it's only in the last few decades in Western culture that single meant that you would live alone. In most cultures around the world, that's not the case. In traditional cultures, in Asia and in Africa, single people would live in extended families. So there is a possibility that single people may feel relational isolation in our culture. And we should acknowledge too that being a single Christian can be harder than being a single non-Christian, because to be single and a faithful Christian means celibacy in our understanding. And if you're a Christian as a virgin, it means you may well remain that way all of your life. And our culture is hypersexualised now. People actually identify with their sexuality, and that makes it harder than ever for single Christian people. If you want to blame someone, you can blame Sigmund Freud, the 1960s sexual revolution, and the pill, which kind of broke the nexus between sex and having children. For most people today, you'd have to say to be single is to be missing out. And at first blush, the Bible doesn't actually seem to help, because in Genesis 2, it says, this is what God said to Adam, "It's not good that the man should be alone." So imagine Adam, he's just been given the task of naming all the animals, and it's sort of implied, has he got a good companion among the animals? Think pig, rat, eagle, antelope, goose, walrus. And for some reason, Adam isn't satisfied, doesn't think there's sufficient compatibility with those options. And so God says, well, I'll make you a helper suitable to you. And Adam's response is, well, hey, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. So you can see a very enthusiastic response. It's not good for the man to be alone. The woman is the solution to his loneliness, therefore singleness is second rate. Spoiler alert, that's not the best way to read the passage. So we'll come back to that. Should you get married or stay single? The rest of verse 25 answers the question. He says, I have no command from the Lord. So it's not a straightforward question. That's the first thing we learn here. It's not that Christianity has nothing to say about singleness or about your life situation. And even though the social conditions in first century Corinth are vastly different than our day, what Paul follows up with is important too. He says in verse 25 at the end, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. So Paul does have something to say, and so does the Christian faith, even though there's no command, so to speak. Paul's not against marriage, but as we'll see, he actually prefers singleness. And he says three things to cheer up the singles in Corinth, and hopefully, having painted a bleak picture, we'll see that they are cheering. The first one is in verses 26 to 28, and it's a point he makes. He says that single people are better placed than married people to cope with the troubles that life throws up. In verse 26, he elaborates on this. He says, because of the present crisis, I think it's good for a man to remain as he is. So remember, he's talking to the engaged men, and he's saying, I think it's actually better you don't go ahead with the marriage at this time. And he says it's because of the present crisis. Now, this is one of these moments when we read the Bible where the original readers knew a lot more than we do, so they would have understood what on earth he was talking about. But ancient historians have looked at Corinth in the AD 50s and found there were some acute grain shortages. There may have been a famine going on, and maybe that's what's going on here. Paul's referring to such an event and the social unrest that may well come from it. And don't forget too that in the ancient world, until quite recently of course, there was no effective contraception. So to get married was to have children. And I think what Paul's alluding to is the added responsibilities of the married state would be felt more acutely in times of economic trouble and hardship. Francis Bacon put it well. He said, children sweeten labours, but they make misfortunes more bitter. So in verses 27 and 28, Paul counsels, are you pledged to a woman? Are you engaged? Do not seek to be released. Don't break it off. Are you free from such a commitment? Don't look for a wife. But if you do marry, you haven't sinned, so he doesn't have a command. It's not a moral question, But those who marry will face troubles, many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. I think that's what he's alluding to. So in Paul's view, singles are better placed than marrieds to cope with the troubles that life throws up. Now, this may well be a major difference in our world, because when disasters like a famine happen in our world, in the West at least, they tend to get sorted quite quickly. So in the ancient world, a famine, the ramifications could go on for years. Whereas in our world, thankfully, when we have a big fire or a flood in Australia, for example, things tend to get sorted to some extent. I know it can take years to recover completely, but within weeks, if not months. So to understand Paul, I think we should think in distressing situations where survival's a priority, getting married might be a luxury that people can't afford. Because of the present crisis, I think it's good for a man to remain as he is. But I think despite the differences in our day, it's still worth thinking about those practical questions and even the financial ones. People might need to think, how does getting married affect my cost of living? Do we earn enough as a couple to live? Now, this can be exaggerated, of course, and people have very high expectations when it comes to lifestyle generally in Melbourne. But nonetheless, it is interesting that Paul would bring up such a practical matter to answer the question. And being married with children does complicate life. It's worth going into marriage with your eyes open. I can tell you from experience, when you're married with children, you are only as happy as your most unhappy child. And it's a difficult situation to be in many cases. But it's true, with the possibility of family planning, to use that term, being married doesn't necessarily lead to a diminished capacity to deal with life's troubles. No doubt, singleness does still have advantages. I think singles are often more mobile and flexible than people who are married. One person's settling down as another person's getting stuck. And there are many remarkable examples in Christian service of single people achieving way more than a married person could achieve. I mean, Peter Adam, to state the obvious, and my dear colleague Anthony McCall was another example. What do we learn then about the Christian faith from this first piece of advice then? It's this: Christian faith is personal, practical, and realistic. It's good news, friends. God is not a cookie cutter. He makes room for our personal desires, our preferences when it comes to questions like whether to get married or not. In verses 36 to 38, he goes on to talk to the Corinthian men who are wondering about getting married. And he says if he feels he ought to get married, if he wants to do this, if he's struggling to control his will, then he should go ahead. So it's an interesting correction, I think, to sometimes how we think about God. We might think about God as a master imposing his will on us willy-nilly. But I think these verses show that this is a mistake. God does issue commands, and in the letter we're reading, 1 Corinthians, you'll see that Paul says to flee sexual immorality and to flee idolatry. Elsewhere he says to flee greed. There'd be three of the big ones, for example. But on questions like singleness and marriage, being a Christian is about living before God, sensibly, honestly, wisely, taking full account of our desires and circumstances. I think that's good news. If Paul's first reason for preferring singleness is in part peculiar to first century Corinth, his second point puts the question in a much broader framework and actually uses some examples beyond getting married or not. And I think it will bring some comfort to those of us who feel like we are missing out for one reason or another. In 26 to 28, single people, according to Paul, are better placed to cope with life's troubles. And then in verses 29 to 31, single people need to take care to remember that the time is short. So these are my favourite verses, friends. They're quite poetic, really. You've got a kind of solemn introduction, 29 to 31. You've got these amazingly startling assertions. There's a kind of poetic rhythm to it, a paradoxical content, and at first blush, they seem very odd. So why does Paul counsel unmarried men in the church it's good for a man to remain as it is? Because the time is short, is what he says at the beginning of verse 29. Time's often a big issue for singles, of course. They might attend weddings and baby showers, and women have an issue around their biological clock and so on. So both single women and single men might feel too in churches that there are fewer and fewer eligible partners as years go by. So what time is Paul referring to? I think the time until what? I think your instinct is right. If you're thinking in context here, there's a period of time remaining until the return of Christ and the end of all things, the new heavens and the new earth. But I don't think Paul simply means there isn't much time left, because in other parts of the letter, he's got his future plans to visit them, and he's taking up, I don't know if you know about this, it's quite extraordinary. Paul was an aid worker, in a sense. He was collecting money for the poor saints in Judea for years, and he tells the Corinthians about that, and it will take some years to play out. Paul's not so much talking about the quantity of time left, but also the quality of time left before Christ's return. The fact that the end is coming affects the character of our time. And the key phrase more literally is the time's been compressed or shortened or gathered in. And our perception of time is different from other senses, actually. You don't have clear raw input when it comes to time. So, for example, you've got photons. I had to look this up, of course, not being a sciencey person. Photons for visual perception and sound waves for hearing. But since time can't be directly perceived, it's reconstructed by the brain. And there's no doubt children experience time differently to adults. Try getting a young child ready for preschool in the morning. Children live in a kind of primordial present that has no past or future. And we too talk about time in different ways. You say time flies when you're having fun. Time drags when you're in the dentist chair. So what does a compressed time feel like? A time compressed by a future event, and how does it affect how we think about the present? I've got an illustration for you. Some time back, I visited the US to teach an intensive at a seminary in Boston at an unspellable state. And I stayed with my good friend Roy Champa. I was teaching 9 to 5 days, and then in the evenings we'd have something to do. One of the evenings I was hoping to visit the Agawam Diner. So think Fonzie and Ralph, if you've ever watched Happy Days. It was a Champa family tradition. I was very much looking forward to it. And at that diner, there were 2 Bostonian specialties, clam chowder and coconut cream pie. So I was really looking forward to this. And then Roy picked me up that afternoon at 5 o'clock when the class was finished and said, "Brian, the time is short. We have to miss the meal at the Agawam Diner because I've got tickets to the baseball game at Boston's Fenway Park." The Red Sox were playing to a packed house. They'd done so for 6 years, and there were 40,000 people there. They have 60 games a year. It was just a fantastic American experience, all with the national anthem. We could only stand the whole time, but it was absolutely worth it. Roy said, "The future has squashed the present. The time is short. In the light of our future priorities, the present has changed. The meal at the Agawam Diner would not occur. But my disappointment was overshadowed by the joy of the prospect of attending the game." That's how Paul reasons. That's his logic for saying the time is short, and then going on to say those really odd things. From now on, those who had wives should live as if they do not. Those who mourn as if they did not. Those who are happy as if they were not. those who buy something as if it was not theirs to keep, those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them. Now, I'm cheating slightly because we went to the Agawam diner the next night. So Paul reasons that in the final stretch of history, we're in the last days, that's how the apostles think about our lives, that knowledge that we're in the end times, that the time's been squashed by this massive future event, helps us to condition how we think about our activity in the meantime. And in the 5 examples, he brings this up. Paul reasons that since believers know where the world is headed, we're not to allow the world to dictate our existence. So the primary purpose of these beautiful verses, 29 to 31, is to set the question of whether to marry or not in proportion and perspective. The prospect of a new heaven and a new earth takes the edge off prevailing troubles on this earth in this age, and it may even enable a believer to endure a marital or social status they consider unsatisfying better than they would otherwise do. According to Paul, being married or not is not central to our identity. What is central is our destiny. We belong to the day that is to come. So marriage or singleness don't define the Christian, because it's a form of this world that's passing away, just as neither do the ups and downs of life, being happy or sad, our involvement in commerce, our jobs, buying things, owning a home, any material gain you want to talk about, our involvement in commerce. We learn that Christians can sit looser to these ups and downs of life than our non-Christian friends, to the business of material gain, to the questions even of marital status, because the future has broken into the present and it results in a relativising of our human social commitments. So as verse 31 puts it, this world in its present form is passing away. So the end urges a new valuation of the present. This, of course, doesn't solve all the singles' problems, but I think it can help to look at our lives in these terms. I love the census when it comes round. The last one was in 2021. You may remember the computer debacle when the computers crashed, because who knew so many Australians would want to fill out the form. The next one's in 2026. Ministers sometimes get obsessed with the census. I don't know if you've ever had these conversations, and they'll tell you about, did you realise 26-year-olds in my suburb have more red hair than any other person around the country? So just ridiculous details they go into. It reminds me of a friend who was trying to control his eating of biscuits. He had a biscuit jar. When you opened it, it said, "Step away from the cookie jar," with the voice of Oscar the Grouch. And I wonder if the census should have a similar thing for some ministers. I suggest, though, next time the census comes round, you fill in the form a little bit differently, as a Christian should. So imagine that happens, and then someone from the census department, if that's a thing, rings you up and says, you know, Brian, we just want to ask you about your answers to the questions on the census. And so what's the problem? Well, I said, well, for occupation, you wrote whatever. And for home ownership, you wrote not applicable. And for marital status, you wrote meh. Now, there's a really bad dad joke coming. I said, I'm really sorry, but the time's been forcibly compressed and the forms of this world are passing away. So Paul says singleness has practical advantages, especially in view of the present crisis. Paul says, in the light of the end, questions of singleness and marriage appear less pressing because the time is short. His third point is that singles need to keep looking on the bright side because something trumps the experience of being married. We see this in verses 32 to 34. In verse 32, Paul says, I would like you to be free from concern or anxiety. And the anxiety that he wants them to be free from is how they're going to serve the Lord. So Paul's changed the focus now. He says, really, the most important thing in life is not your marital status, it's serving the Lord effectively with undivided devotion. And singles, in Paul's view, are in a better position to live devoted to Christ. They have fewer distractions. I'm saying this for your own good, he says in 35, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way, undividedly devoted to the Lord. So should you get married or stay single? Paul's answer is, it depends. With such personal decisions, I have no command from the Lord. But I hear you say, didn't Genesis 2 tell us that it's better to be married than single? Well, I think the context, as usual, when you read the Bible, is important because it's not Adam's loneliness that requires a partner. It's his mandate, his commission to tend the garden and name the animals and look after the earth. So the job of working and keeping the garden's too big for Adam. Eve may well relieve his loneliness, but that's not the point. She's a helper, his partner, his companion, one who works alongside fulfilling that commission. Singleness can be hard. It's hard to be happily unmarried. But being married can also be hard. And the Bible is bluntly realistic about all the marital statuses. And all of them have challenges. It doesn't view marriage in ideal terms. There are some very dark moments from Genesis to Revelation about marriages and families. You can be happily married, also unhappily married. You can be unhappily single, and you can be happily single. So, a few reflections just to close. Living well as singles or marrieds is obviously the key. Now, I have to say, though, the Bible doesn't pretend that singleness is easy. So, I don't know if you know the story in Judges where Jephthah makes a terrible vow. He says, the first thing I see when I return home, I will sacrifice to you. You know the story? You can look up the artwork. It's just so poignant. And he rides up and his daughter runs out. Yep, it's a terrible vow. It's one of the reasons the Bible says, be careful making vows. But do you know what Jephthah's daughter says? She says, please give me 2 months, quote, to roam the hills and weep with my friends because I will never marry. This was the world of the Old Testament. It's not the world of the New Covenant, but still, singleness can be very difficult, and we should acknowledge that. Jesus' choice was to remain single. Paul, as far as we can tell, was also single. So there is an honouring and esteeming of the single state, just as there is of the married state. But the main question this passage puts to us is, how can we best serve the Lord? Now, obviously, that's not the question the world's putting, and it's very rarely, let's be frank, the question we put to ourselves. So serving the Lord with undivided devotion, whether married or single, should be our priority. Now, a word probably needs to be said about those who are single more by circumstance than choice. And at points in the church's history, we've denigrated marriage. We thought that priests and nuns had a kind of extra pious level in God's sight. Today, probably, we've made the opposite error. We've deified marriage and family life, and we've left singles sometimes feeling marginalised and inadequate. The Bible doesn't put up with either imbalance, and nor should we. And in the Bible's vision of the body of Christ, which is really what we're thinking about in this series, intimacy and affection is not reserved for married couples in nuclear families with white picket fences. So there's a real sense in which we're meant to have that intimacy and affection for each other, married or not. In verse 29, Paul calls the Corinthian Christians brothers and sisters. And we kind of take this for granted, and it's kind of a cringe if we were to use that language these days. Good to see you, brother. Good to see you, sister. But it was revolutionary. In the first century, Jews called each other brother and sister because of their bloodlines. No pagans called each other brother and sister. So there was a level of affection and intimacy sown into the early church, which we need to be careful to maintain. So following Christ is hard for all of us. There's a cost for all of us as his followers, but we need to be sensitive to our single Christian friends. Much preaching is by those who are married with children to those who are married with children, and it's not a great approach unless we think hard about how to think of the case of others. So, are you worried about missing out because you're single? You should be. You're right to be concerned that you'll miss out and not be complete, whether you're married or not, because none of us are bound to be unloved and lonely, because the devotion to Christ which Paul speaks of in 32 to 35 gives us a hint as to what in his mind trumps our marital status and its importance. So our loneliness, brothers and sisters, is not finally solved in our marriage partner, but in our enjoyment of Christ, our groom, and his people. The real marriage not to miss out on, whether we're male or female, single or married, is our marriage to Christ. We look forward to the wedding to end all weddings. Let us rejoice and be glad and give him the glory, for the wedding of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. Fine linen, bright and clean, was given her to wear. And I saw an angel standing in the sun who cried in a loud voice to all the birds flying in midair, "Come, gather together for the great supper of God." We belong to the day that is to come.